We can probably start just by talking about the book a bit. And I was saying just before we went live that, you know, it's such an odd thing having, and I'm sure the experience is the same for you, a thinker that you sort of you admire and who you sort of know personally. I think the true of both of us to various extents. You know, undergo all sorts of kind of strange transmutations after their death, and you know, the experience of reading this book, which I should say, you know, obviously it's a transcript from recordings of lectures given to a postgraduate module on Postcapitalist Desire. It was, you know, having seen the reception of the big Mark Fisher brick, the doorstop book, the kind of mighty tome. This felt very different. It felt, you know, intimate, but it also felt, you know, very alive. And it was absolutely, you know, it was quite special actually to be reading, you know, reading a transcript of Mark, and therefore, you know, remembering those kinds of speculative flights of thought, the kind of very intense engagements with thinkers, the sense that for him, these particular thinkers were not just interesting, but were essential in one sense or another, that they spoke. He actually says in the book he hates the phrase "speak to," so I will avoid that. But that they are relevant to the moment in the sense that they give us tools for thinking about how we might move through it or overcome it. So I just thought we should start there really and say you know, thank you for getting it out.
That's great. Yes, well, it was a pleasure to make it. It's a pleasure to see people enjoy it so much, and I think it's a really good point, I think, regarding how Mark's work is seen even whilst he was alive. Because I guess it's what's so striking about that huge doorstop, and I mean, all credit due to Darren Ambrose for doing what must have been such an intense undertaking. But I totally appreciate the desire to do it, because I think when we think about the 3 books that Mark did publish whilst he was alive, Capitalist Realism, Ghosts of My Life, and The Weird and the Eerie, they're all of them are very slim, relatively speaking. And I guess it's trying to illuminate the fact that Mark was so intensely productive, and there was so much material out there of him sort of thinking aloud on his blog and elsewhere. And trying to do that justice is I think it was unsurprising when it was announced, and it was the size that it was, because it was kind of like what was underneath the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, I think that the anxiety of trying to collect everything together is kind of an impossibility, and that's one of the things I'm actually quite was quite nice realizing in putting this together, that at first I think there was the assumption that it would just be a nice novelty to, I guess, part of the I don't know if I don't mention this in the book itself, but the first lecture I transcribed just for the fun of it, not long after Mark died, and shared it around as a Google Doc, and that felt like the kind of anticipated eventually would just do the same with the other 5, and not give it that kind of stature of being printed and bound, precisely because it's so unfinished, but actually considering the impossibility of gathering everything together. I think its unfinished nature's actually kind of a blessing in disguise, really. It becomes a nice springboard rather than something so intimidating as, everything together.
Right. I mean, the other element, though, that I think is important is that, you know, one of the things that collecting someone's work together in a single volume can conceal is the way in which thinking changes over time, and the way in which it's so responsive to its circumstances. I mean, one of the things that's really noticeable sort of reading this book is that the lectures are taking place at a point at which, you know, it's a very interesting political moment, because, you know, Corbynism and Sandersism haven't, you know, spun themselves apart yet. So there's a kind of renaissance in that sense of the left, but it's also on the back of these kind of years of, and I mean really years, I'm not speaking kind of post 2008 there. And I think one of the things that these lectures are very, very interested in, and that recurs as a motif throughout them, maybe we can come on to talk about it a bit, is, this question of periodization, this question of, where we are historically, what the defining moment which leads us to the impasse that we're in is. Do we locate it in 73? Do we locate it in 89? Do we, and so on and so on and so on. Which is a question which recurs through Mark's work, but it's obviously one of the things that's driving the question here, because he thinks it's important to these political projects to know what it is that they're trying to fight against, or what they're trying to overcome or move through. The other thing that struck me, though, I think, just which is maybe an easier jumping off point than periodization, is that that he's such a key thinker of why isn't this thing working, and this is such a central question to him, I think, throughout. And his answers, I think, in the preface, that his answers to this question change quite a lot over time. Why is it that the left has failed? Why is it that we don't seem to be able to overcome, this, that, the other? And so, I think, we can come on to, again, a polemic with the left, or some kind of criticism with, or thinking with the left, which runs through these lectures as well. But I just think maybe that's the place to start then, that question of, why isn't it working? What's the, what you see as the questions that are driving, the instantiations of that question in this text, seem to me to be very much about this question that there is a kind of historical aberration, that we've gone down the wrong path somewhere, and it's kind of trying to trace it back, and trying to trace also the kind of intellectual consequences of that. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I think so. I think one way of putting it maybe is, if it's not a question of why hasn't, or what isn't working, but as if maybe Mark's pointing at the fact that the left in general is always obsessed with the idea of why didn't this work? And as if to say that I think there's something that Mark even talks about in the first lecture, where he's kind of questioning the title of his own series of talks, and the concept of post-capitalism being something that's stuck in the sort of tyranny of the post. But I think that's kind of a thread that runs through Mark's work, from being interested in post-punk to post-2008 to post-capitalism. It's like he's always dealing with this strange tension within the sort of the immediate moment after things were meant to get better and then didn't. And maybe it's a question of, if not, I guess there's a certain twistedness there. That it's maybe not what could we have done in a melancholic sense, but what can we do now, whilst at the same time realizing the limitations of where we are, or even us paying more attention to our strengths, and maybe just the whole confusion of, I guess that's it. The tyranny of the post also being sort of that tyranny of postmodernism. The whole ambiguity of kind of the being desperate for. I was reading a Evan Calder-Williams book, Combined on an Even Apocalypse, which I think was one of the early Zero books, and he's got this great line that it almost seems like a response to capitalist realism, where he's sort of saying that all these films about the end of the world that seem also concerned with the end of capitalism, they're sort of striving for the clarity of the post-apocalyptic, like to say things have finished, now what? And it's kind of that untangling and unpacking that desire, I guess, for all intents and purposes, is kind of the issue that Mark was always grappling with.
Right. Well, I think that first lecture, maybe we should say, so the structure of these is that there are these 5 lectures here, which are a fragment, obviously, of a longer course, which was never delivered. In the first lecture, there is a kind of programmatic one, which sort of sketches out a trajectory for what the course might be. And I think it's really, I think it's an interesting one in some ways, because, you get this kind of arc in the 5 lectures that we do have. One, this kind of attempt at a sort of generalized thinking through, and then these engagements with these various texts, including some Marcuse, which I think is really, really essential, actually. And it was nice to see You know, something I've often thought is that it's a curious fact that you have at this historic moment a kind of a deep interest in the way that kind of capitalism and desire you know, work together or you know, are instantiated with each other. And you know, and Marcuse is hugely successful, and this account is obviously talking to something which is really clearly you know, fundamental you know, in the conjuncture, that it says something to these people about exactly the experience that they're having at the end of the 60s and in the 70s, and then it kind of drops off. You know, it sort of absolutely disappears from theoretical view. I mean, you know, I think Mark, you know, actually remarks in one of the lectures that, you know, that it's actually it's quite hard to find Marcuse in print these days. You know, you have to go to sort of Aid books and find, which is, you know, which I think is, you know, hugely important. So it's really, you know, I think, you know, to be honest, I think repressive desublimation is quite an important concept that we should, you know, reclaim and, you know, and actually think about, you know, more systematically these days. But anyway, to say, you know, that these lectures then go through these various other texts. You've got some Lukács in there, you know, very difficult texts in some ways. You've got Ellen Willis's, you know, really fascinating text about the kind of failure of counterculture. You've got some really kind of like ultra negationist Lyotard, which is, you know, maybe we should talk about as well. But yeah, so these existing lectures kind of trace this kind of arc, which I think is, it could maybe even be misleading in some ways, right? Because it ends up in that sort of, you know, ultra negationist moment. Whereas I think actually the course that's described in the first lecture is actually one that, you know, I think he even says, you know, I'm going to try and end this on a positive note, which is, you know, captures some of the real difficulties of thinking about this stuff, right? Is to kind of try and, you know, as an act of kind of, you know, like intellectual combat, to kind of claw yourself into a position where you can, where you're not seduced by, because it is seductive, this sort of, you know, ultra negationist tendency, which I think, you know, there's a school of sort of Mark Fisher reception that has him as a sort of ultra negationist, you know, like, which I think is, you know, it's there. I mean, it's definitely part of what's going on there. It's not the whole thing. So no, you get this arc, but, you know, some of the stuff that's not in there and that's described in the first bit, you know, extends as far as Paul Mason's post-capitalism book, which I think would have been very interesting. There's some Helen Hester, the xenofeminist stuff there as well. You know, there's accelerationism, which kind of runs as a thread throughout it, like not necessarily a helpful concept. But so that's just to describe to people like what's going on there. But it does seem to me that it's kind of conjuncturally reflective, right? It's trying to reflect on this moment in which, like, the question, you know, the question of political scope is you know, more open at that point than it has been, I think, in a long time. Probably more open, frankly, than it is right now, which is sort of depressing to think. So it seems to me that this is, you know, this is a kind of sketch towards you know, maybe it's a sketch to some of the thinking that, I mean, you suggest in the preface, a sketch towards some of the thinking that might have ended up in the sort of acid communism book, that it might have ended up, you know, as part of that, of the same kind of conjunctural analysis, which I think, you know, underlay the very slim intervention in capitalist realism. It feels to me like this is working towards, you know, part two, that it's trying to think, okay, you know, capitalist realism, hugely kind of successful and really important book in many ways, I think, describes, you know, spoke to a moment much like the Marcuse book speaks to its moment at its time, and then thinking, okay, so what, you know, but something has changed since. So what is it? How do I, you know, what has failed to be realized, and what's gone in directions I didn't expect?
Yeah, and I feel like that's kind of the great shame of it not appearing, but also maybe part of the reason, for putting this together in the first place, that it is quite striking, all the different intellectual adventures Mark sort of went on after capitalist realism, and even just before. There is a certain lag, I think, almost with his books, which is, I think, especially true with The Weird and the Eerie, where Mark's kind of gathering together material that was pre-capitalist realism. So there's always like him trying to distill. He's always distilling something that's maybe been settled a decade before, at least in his mind, and then dragging it forwards. And it's that strange process of, like, maybe it's not that strange in actual reality, but in terms of perceiving it and trying to understand where he was coming from, I think it leads to a lot of twisted and confusing different threads, precisely as you say. But yeah, my sense is that acid communism does seem to be, or was perhaps going to be, I mean, yeah, it's impossible to say, obviously, but some sort of firm a commitment. I think that's arguably what it. I think that it's something that again tries to pull out in the preface that a lot of what Mark was doing was always critical, and yeah, I think as you kind of suggested before, even critical of the left, and that's kind of his most controversial essay, Exiting the Vampire's Castle, is obviously a very large part of that. But I think there was I was in a conversation yesterday, someone was suggesting that capitalist realism is less of a critique of capitalism as a whole and actually more of a critique of New Labour, and the kind of the failures or the lost opportunities that maybe came from, well, I mean, not to try and salvage New Labour, but at least dealing with the outcome of that moment. And yeah, I think that around that you have, the Marx reading of hauntology, accelerationism, and that kind of the negation of the ultra negationism. I think is a striking point that I think at least maybe rattled Mark in an interesting way, maybe productively. Not that he was that person, but it's there, as you said. But I always think that part of that whole accelerationist moment was this sort of fight between an affirmation of negation or a negation of affirmation, and that whole jumble it was never really resolved, and just then collapsed under its own weight, I suppose. And now we have the mess that acceleration is now known as. But as the communism feels like, it was the if not just the sequel, but the sort of just a commitment. Not just capitalist realism's the critique, and acid communism is, well, here's what we do about it. And I think maybe it's Mark learning all the lessons of being maybe, especially on the kind of front line, or at least coming up to the front line of what was kind of a popular leftist discussion, being sort of becoming known and being championed by people like Russell Brand, and at least at that time, sort of, I think when there wasn't this, I guess it's quite striking to think now that there is this push to have this leftist culture online, which you've obviously been a part of yourself with Novara Media, but it's kind of strange to think that of just how much of a void there was before that and Mark kind of being, maybe, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but kind of pushing open that space a bit for what could be done online, and it's striking how unexplored that territory was. And I think he was burned as many times as he had successes, and I feel like acid communism is maybe not just an explication of leftist history as he sees it, and also alternative histories, but even learning the lessons, the acid maybe being the acid qualifier, I almost said speaking to them as well, being related to that, the new challenges and opportunities that are brought about by new technologies, but specifically for discussion and communication, I guess.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's the sense, and I think it's always a kind of very strong sense. There's a kind of certainty which is lent kind of retrospectively to lots of Marx's interventions, which at the time are much more controversial than they seem. I remember when Mark deleted his Twitter. At the time, of course, this is a very, very minor point, but it felt like an unimaginable thing to do, because we were still in the kind of afterglow of the sort of post Tahrir Square sort of, this is still, even for its kind of the fact, despite the fact that it has already started to collapse into a sort of neurotic, squabbling vindictiveness, and that its detrimental effects were becoming really obvious by that point. There was still this sort of rather hopeful sense that the technology could deliver a dream of communication that had seemed to elude us for a long time before, that sort of promise of immediacy and authenticity. And it felt very, it felt very daring to say, actually, no, I my judgment on this thing is that it is bad. I'm going to take action, to reject it. Now, obviously, from now retrospectively, it seems like the discourse now is very strong on the way these kind of technologies do things to the self, and so there are very often moments, I think, when you have to sort of pinch yourself and think, oh no, this was actually written almost 5 years ago, or these thoughts were going on 5-10 years ago. So I felt that very often kind of throughout these lectures actually. I think we should talk, maybe a little bit about psychedelia, because you mentioned the qualifier of acid to communism there, and I think there's a passage in the lectures where Mark says that he'd gone, as I think a lot of us go back and forth on, the difference between kind of post-capitalist as something that lurks in the tyranny of periodization, which is always described as something that, despite being afterwards, is nonetheless conditioned by, and is conditioned even by, its kind of rejection or progression from capitalism, versus, say, socialism or communism, and then whether those are tarnished by the sort of either the sort of like startling greyness and dullness of many kind of historic state socialist projects, or the rather blacker and rather darker crimes of historically existing communism. And so and he says these qualifications. So he says acid, but he also mentions, of course, luxury communism, and that they have this consciousness jarring effect, this kind of defamiliarization, which forces you to engage with the concepts again and maybe shrug off some of those associations, and that there is something actually attractive about a kind of positive project. It always struck me from the associate, it's such an odd word in some ways to associate with communism, not just because of its historic countercultural associations, but also the sort of rather useful, I think, lexical ambiguity in acid. Are we talking about something here that is psychotropic, or are we talking here about something that eats through metal? Like there is that rather lovely duality to it that I think is never really brought out in discussion about it, but it's always I think it's always there in it has an echo in it. So yeah, it's talk to me a bit about your take on the psychedelia here, because because it is a controversial question. I think it's probably obviously the most controversial bit of your own introduction would be to push back on relatively easy appropriations of psychedelia, and to say that there's something to be pushed back against there.
I think the way I ground it in the introduction, which I'm still quite partial to, is I think it maybe comes from this thread of thinking that quite subtly informs a lot of what Mark's doing. And that may be quite obviously when he sort of popularized this cultural version of hauntology, borrowed from Jacques Derrida. But I think that maybe when I think about that period when hauntologies first emerged, well, the 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, but the thinking that's kind of going on around then, I always think of that series for Verso that I think Zizek edited, or maybe a couple, that was like called The Idea of Communism or something, kind of running with the idea that as much as communism itself has been, the ultimate success of capitalism supposedly, and how the communism is now vanquished, the idea persists. But I suppose that a part of that is precisely that is lost is that the material impact of the debate around communism and Marxism. That to say that it's focusing on the idea seems like a strange step back almost. And I guess that I always take the psychedelia that Mark's talking about. I think he also talks about things like digital psychedelia, which is, precisely as you sort of say, that the ambiguation shocks and unsettles whatever ground is taken as a given for being there, but also that it psychedelia is manifesting what is in the mind, and that being taken to be in terms of hallucination, but also in terms of, well, like Marx's famous adage that you need not to interpret the world, but to change it. I think that there's the tension that in that argument that Marx keeps pulling out at different points. Like it's kind of what I love about the lecture on Lukács, where he's talking about the Lukács's book History and Class Consciousness being a trippy book, as if to say that it's both like the language used is as if it's some kind of like sci-fi vernacular, but also the way that it makes you think about consciousness, and not consciousness as an idea, but as a material, well, I suppose problem, and whether that's false consciousness or some sort of real consciousness, whatever that is. Like consciousness itself, especially right now, is such a mixed and confused term. I can always think of the sort of the unending conversations around being red pilled online, as if taking that analogy from the Matrix of like taking a pill and then suddenly being more in touch with reality, to kind of be twisted and become its opposite, and that what's truth just becomes totally detached from whatever it was previously attached to. As soon as I start thinking about it, I think it just becomes difficult to actually ground anywhere, and that's partly the problem. But Marx sort of puts forward a way of doing that's not dry and academic, but actually says, no, this process is kind of wild. You need to like tinker with your own head a bit. And there's actually some fun to be had in that doesn't necessarily involve like getting off your face. You can kind of push at your own perspective on the world, and that's praxis. So like it's for as far as asset communism goes, that's kind of how I see it as being, well, if not what it was going to be, but why that phrase is maybe useful. That for all of its challenges and for all of its different definitions, I suppose, that could possibly be out there, the debate is kind of part of the process that I guess in a way we're already having.
Mm-hmm. But
I suppose it's that's partly what Marx was so good at, in a way, that if the ideas themselves aren't necessarily original and are actually grounded in a great like the sort of the history of critical theory or just history in general, Marx's great talent was making that feel fresh and new, and being the gateway into engaging with perhaps potentials and modes of thinking that we've kind of forgotten about, or have gotten too used to.
Right. I mean, I think there's a something that is recurrent throughout. It's obviously there in various of the lectures in this book, but it's also I think very obviously there in in some of the earlier work as well, which is like this absolute insistence on defamiliarizing things that you've taken for granted. And in one sense that can be done through just simply through historicizing them. And this is this is an important part, I think, of some of the one strand of the thought here. But I think the other one, and I think it returns us to this question of psychedelia. The other strand of this thought is to do with consciousness raising, and so this is a big concern of two of the lectures. Really, is to think about, okay, what does it mean to have that often quite alienating or disorienting experience of consciousness changing, right? Of those things that you've taken, as naturalized and historical facts, being revealed to be utterly contingent. And it can be a really deeply disorienting and vertiginous thing. And so I wonder if you could just say, because I think it's important for us to touch on it. This question of consciousness raising, it's unfortunate, and I think it started in the last couple of years to start to be kind of reclaimed as a practice, or as an idea, or as something to be aimed at. and there have been groups, some groups which were groups that Mark was involved in at various times, who have attempted to undertake kind of consciousness raising sessions and to start that in the experience of everyday life and undertake these kind of collective research projects. So I wonder, because I think it's important to say that this isn't, the consciousness raising has a very specific definition here, that it's linked to this, to standpoint epistemology, for instance, which I think is also a kind of crucial part of the argument.
Yeah. So for Mark in the, I think it's maybe the second or third lecture, they kind of, there's a nice overlap that's kind of a strength of the book, but I think for the Mark's thinking anyway, that's besides the point. Standpoint epistemology, I think for Mark, he puts it in a way that's I find really quite provocative and useful, which is that everybody has a point of view, but some points of view are better than others. And I think he makes that point via Nancy Hartsock's theory of standpoint epistemology, where she uses tells the story of someone cleaning a bathroom, and that which I think is it's a really useful analogy to just imagine, say, the cleaner in a bathroom of some swanky hotel who will see all these sort of maybe the luxurious nature of that space, how it's used by people that are probably pay no mind to it as a space. That it's despite the luxury of it, she's the person that cleans it, so she kind of understands more, or he or she, I should say. I think I can't remember it doesn't matter. But in seeing sort of from the structure of this building or this business from the bottom upwards, understands how maybe the behavior in a bathroom is connected to maybe the disregard the higher up, like I almost imagine it as like the opposite of a trickle down economics or something. Like you can kind of see how what precisely in seeing what is unseen, I suppose, is the point. The vantage point from that perspective as a worker is far wider in scope than it would be for someone higher up, which is precisely why I think that I think Mark makes the point that whilst anyone can kind of raise their own consciousness to understand their own perspective in the world and maybe their own privileges or whatever else, recognizing that is not it doesn't really instill any kind of agency as a default. The revolutionary class will always be the person at the bottom who can see everything. And I feel like that's it's a useful interjection, I think, in some ways, when for maybe clarifying some of the stakes that we kind of have when talking about identity politics, which I guess just as a phrase is kind of seen as this essential part of contemporary political discourse, or is derided as this kind of hollow tyranny that just doesn't really mean anything and just undermines everything that we could be doing, and whether that's on the right or the left. And I feel like that's something that Mark was maybe trying to say in Exiting the Vampire Castle, and maybe didn't do so well. And then, but I think then committed and spent the next few years engaging with how to actually make that argument better, and not just make it in print to for the sake of sort of an online commentary, but actually do the work. So yeah, as you mentioned, Mark, getting involved with places like Plan C and doing consciousness raising workshops there, and writing essays for them, especially. I think a bunch of Mark's essays on the Plan C website that are clearly dealing with the same issues as Exiting the Vampire Castle, but written in the years afterwards, show a far more nuanced and kind of considerate argumentation for how we can build what he calls group consciousness. So we can have the sense that consciousness raising, I guess, to be said is very in its specific historical context comes from this like second wave feminism and women meeting to discuss their own material conditions, and when realizing that they are shared, building consciousness around their own agency or the obstacles that face them as a I was going to say class. I guess class is probably a decent enough word, but I guess Mark's intention then is maybe to kind of jog the conversation along. So we have consciousness raising, and there's nothing wrong with it, and it works fine. But we have these additional layers, like we have intersectionality, and standpoint epistemology, and these phrases all work in different contexts for different purposes. And I kind of feel like what Mark's building towards is bridging the gap between them, bringing them together and suggesting, well, what about group consciousness, where we can kind of understand and re-emphasize class consciousness as being something that he says, argues, I think, quite well, that has been purposefully diminished in political discourse since the rise of New Labour or neoliberalism in general. Recentering class without decentering gender, race, etc. Bringing kind of an intersectional discourse that considers the whole Venn diagram, and building a practice that can, a consciousness raising practice that can do justice to the new complexities that we're kind of living under.
Right. I mean, I think I think one of the things that's so interesting about these lectures, I think I agree that that's one of the, research projects really that's underlying it, right? That's kind of there, underneath. And, there's, I copied the quote somewhere because I thought it was useful. It says, it's simply about a problem where things don't actually intersect properly, where instead of a development of a consolidated group consciousness, there are identitarian squabbles among these groups. What if the opposite were the case? What if it had been possible to develop a form of political struggle which would genuinely intersect all of these forms of subordination in order to overcome them? And then there were hints of this in the US in the 1970s. And so I think, yes. I think, so this is one of the things that's really important, I think, is one, the sense in which as I think any kind of serious engagement with Marx's work will tell you, he's not a kind of anti-identitarian thinker in a sort of simplistic, polemical, rather kind of, covertly reactionary sense, which I think he's sometimes made out to be, which is of course bollocks. But is genuinely interested in this problem, and rightly, because of course it can't be denied, recognizes that this is, in some ways, the fundamental problem of agency, of political agency today. And so it's interesting, to me, that this is something that for him is connected to, this is a route for him into a polemic with the left, because regardless of recognizing that this question is central, he's also recognizing that the way in which the left deals with it has been so far, pretty shambolic. It is not a good thing. It is not productive of political agency, and is not productive of group consciousness to endlessly reiterate kind of your position of abjection or victimhood or passivity over and over on the internet in kind of increasingly sort of poisonous and self-destructive ways, right? So that's obviously a bad idea. But it's not so simple as saying well, just don't do that, and then there's an obvious other political program out there. It's saying that actually the kind of historical process which has put us in this situation is one which which we then actually have to go through, right? There's no return. I have to say, so I've been putting together a sort of selection of clips from historic Novara FM episodes, and it obviously includes a very early interview with Mark, in which the same point is being made. This must be kind of 2011, maybe 2012. I think it's 2011. The same point is being made about that there isn't the possibility of return is always fictitious, right? There is the reverse gear doesn't exist. This is not possible. That's actually a Tony Blair line.
Oh no.
Well, there we go.
Repurpose.
Détourne. But this leads to this kind of polemic with the left, where he's drawing on the kind of Gibson Graham, but also what they're drawing on there, of course, the rather I think extraordinary Wendy Brown essay on left melancholy, and there's such an interest in melancholy here, as a political phenomenon, right? The way in which that one can carry around the burden of historic failure with you, right? That it becomes kind of internal to left thought. There's a line in the Brown essay where she talks about loving left analysis and left kind of culture more than you actually love the world that you're desiring to change. And there is something about these kind of these historic attachments which are, I think you can see in the process of that lecture in particular. You can see this realization that the left, because of its processes of acculturation, also accultures people to carry this stuff around with them, right? That you become conscious, you become politically conscious, and part of that coming to political consciousness is a realization of actually the kind of catastrophic history that you therefore inherit. And I can't necessarily propose a way out of that, but I think it's a very important historical problematic, because it does it conditions what people regard as the space for and the possibility of action. It conditions, it conditions, I think the way Mark puts it, and I think it's the explanation of his interest in Russell Brand, for instance, is about confidence, is about, he remarks, for instance, that someone like Lukács is very confident in using the term knowledge or science, and that these things, this kind of confidence, even this kind of confidence in our own political perception, under the burden of failure and our attachment to that failure and our attachment to our defeated projects, it comes to be utterly vitiated. So that's my reading of where the polemic with the left is going. I just wonder about your thoughts. I will stop.
No, it's brilliant, actually. I think you've done it's an amazing kind of encapsulation of it, I think. And it reminds me of the one of Mark's later K-Punk posts, I think, which is initially about Game of Thrones, or maybe he mentions Game of Thrones, but I think the title of it is Abandon All Hope, brackets, Summer is Coming, where he precisely makes that point. It's not about hope. Hope is kind of like a dangling carrot. It's about confidence. And I think what the way he's trying to ground that, again, it's precisely from the quote that you read out too, where he talks about what's the conditions for now, and then goes back into history and talks about the 70s. And I guess the point of doing that for Mark, which is kind of to be it is quite surprising, I think, for a lot of his readers, when the initial Acid Communism intro was shared and published, that he was going back to a time that he'd previously been less than kind about, but actually noticing that it's reneging on his own sense of disappointment, and saying, these are the conditions for. I guess it's kind of similar to the argument of like luxury communism too, right? That the conditions for red plenty were inefficient in the 20th century, but actually now we'd probably arguably and confidently we could argue that we're in a better position now to make that a reality. And I think that that's not just Marx kind of taking more of a kind of cultural and subjective standpoint on that same problem, that we got pretty close to having that sense of group consciousness once before. And I guess that's the problem of May 68, of having that conjunction of students and workers coming together and shutting down the French economy, essentially. And maybe it didn't give out and lead to the blissful utopia we hoped it would, but we got really close, and arguably we could get even closer now. And it's kind of doing that, having that historical understanding of what nearly happened, and having a new appreciation for the conditions of the present, and using both of those in tandem to build confidence. And I think it's a difficult, I think articulating that, like having the critique and the commitment in tandem, sort of being a committed leftist whilst also being able to critique the left and not fall into the impotence of either or, but both and. It's what he spent so much of the last few years of his life really trying to articulate, that sense of positivity. And I feel like that's hopefully that's that's the one thing that's kind of so frustratingly not well, I mean, maybe not quite as present as it could have been had this in this collection. If only the lectures would have gone forwards. I'm sure he would only add more strings to the argument, to his bow that he was sort of building over the course of those 15 weeks. We only have a third of the parts assembled, but it's a pretty decent starting point for actually emboldening ourselves, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should talk, I think, maybe a little about kind of the sort of the Lyotard stuff and the question of negation, the question of like, sort of, I mean, it's the other thread I think that runs through like a lot of Marx's work is an attraction to anyone who breaks the kind of pietistic taboo within the left. It's one of the things I think that initially attracted him. And it's certainly, I have a similar tendency, not I think necessarily as pronounced, but like I get very impatient with the idea that there is sort of that the left has to operate through this sort of virtuous abjuration of all kinds of pleasure and things like that. And I'm attracted to anyone who sort of pushes against that. So this is just saying that last lecture there, it sort of broaches the sort of, the thing that, Lyotard makes this, it's extremely complex, extremely vicious, very sarcastic text in a lot of ways. But my reading of Marx, reading of it, and the thing that interests him in it, and the thing I think that interests me in it as well, is this sense, okay, what is the taboo thing for the left to think? Well, one of the taboo things for the left to think, and one of the things the left doesn't like to think because it's a very awkward thing to think about, is that is that there must be, if someone says under capitalism that they enjoy something, then they're either wrong and need to be talked out of it, or lying to themselves, or produce, or have been produced. The polite way often of putting it is to say that their desires have been in some ways kind of malformed or preformed by capital, or that they are so sort of the long-standing suffering subject who will at some point be redeemed by the revolution. And you can see how that's an attractive way of thinking. It certainly was an attractive way of thinking if you go back to sort of 19th century pre-Marxist socialists in, certainly in France, for instance. This is basically the fundamental way of thinking about, the lot of people in struggle. The way it develops then, I think, or the way that Marx develops it, the way that Marx reads Lyotard developing it, is to do exactly with those, that question of how desire is formed through and under capitalism, and actually what the left might be lying to itself about there. And so I wonder if you could develop a bit of that.
Yeah, I think trying to get to grips with the Lyotard text in itself is it's not something I could ever profess to having any confidence in doing. But I think I share your attraction. But what I see in Marx's interest, and I think also maybe of the I think it's maybe worth mentioning just how central that text was in a way to his initial thinking. The translation that you will find in English was done by Ian Hamilton Grant, who was a peer of Marx at the University of Warwick whilst he was doing his PhD. And so Lyotard's refusal was very much in the air at that time when Marx was part of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. But I think what the legacy that I feel like it has within Marx's own thinking is precisely this tension between punk and post-punk. And I think the punk being understood as that great I don't know how applicable it would be to Marcuse. I was going to say the great refusal. Maybe it is in a way, but that just that unleashing of negativity and the no of no future. But it's the question of then, which is a line that Mark, I think one of my favorites of Mark, was it's about turning that nothing into something, and that's the strength of post-punk. And I guess that it's that trajectory that kind of follows through. There's this initial thrust of negativity in the in the late 90s, early 2000s that is, I guess, cyberculture in a way. I guess that's something that you can see in the Matrix. That is kind of always my go-to point for trying to understand the kind of cultural significance of the significance of in the popular culture anyway, of sort of cybernetics on the political imagination. And that association with being online as being this refusal of a wider society, of conformity, of work, essentially. But then when that no kind of, as was probably all too predictable, we see that just like the hippies themselves sort of become the dot-com millionaires of the 90s, we sort of see this, the cyberpunks of the 90s becoming sort of these new reactionaries of the 2000s, 2010s. And I guess it's that Mark and a lot of his peers were kind of really engaged in that moment and its aftermath. What's post-cyberpunk, if that's a thing? And I think I think that gesture is wholly tied up in Mark's understanding of his of K-punk being precisely that kind of gesture. So yeah, I feel like in a way it's kind of what's the quite fitting about Leotard being the final lecture in a way, that it's Mark it's sort of introducing from that kind of maybe an intellectualization of that refusal that is kind of maybe associated with an unthinking, a refusal of thinking, a refusal of thought, or just a kind of the which I guess is something that he's doing throughout acid communism, even like especially in the intro, he's kind of suggesting that the initial idea of post-work society emerging in pop culture is from sort of slacker culture or from the Beatles psychedelia, the stay in bed, float upstream refusal of work. But how to then, not let that moment die and fizzle out into nothing, and to just become acquiescence to whatever is going on. And I think that Leotard's text, in a way, in a very complex way, is trying to articulate the paradox of that, of how you can champion your own kind of refusal to engage, or your own attempts to numb yourself to whatever's going on around you, and kind of affirm that as a political act, but not rest there. And it's what comes afterwards, right?
Right, exactly, and that's where my suspicion of this stuff often comes in, right? Is that I am very, so it's funny. So the text itself is interested in, that this is always grounded historically, right, in a moment of kind of historical catastrophe, or kind of historical delinking of labor and desire, as it were, right? So you think of like organized labor and say the student movement. This is more pronounced, I think, somewhere like Italy after it's 68, where you have these two movements which are kind of talking to each other and eventually start to kind of branch out in these two very different directions. They never quite manage to interface, and it ends with the kind of real, really deep chasm between them. And I think you see in the kind of gradual ossification of both sides of that split exactly why they would need to be linked together. I mean, there's something interesting here about that question of the historical burden of failure and how you might, shrug it off and become kind of confident again or renewed again. In that, this is one of the reasons I think that you get these attractions in lots of Mark's work too. Questions like libido, desire, consciousness raising, the taboo breaking of Leotard, all of that stuff is attentive to that moment of like how you shift that. I think also that's the acceleration or the attraction to acceleration, or the kind of accelerationist manifesto. There's lots of stuff I suppose we could talk about, but we should probably move to questions very, very shortly. Funnily enough, I was about to say that one of the things that Mark says is the enemy of consciousness raising is, of course, time. But I think it's and I think I think it genuinely is just important to say that, like, it can feel like we're talking as if there had been kind of huge social shifts in the space of just a few years. over the course of his work. I think in some sense that's true, but there's also like the things that remain hallmarks of Marx thinking is, what some other thinkers have called a kind of social sadism. This question of like benefit street, for instance, is an object of hatred for him. This kind of rather disgusting voyeuristic documentary, like a generalized sort of loathing, sadism, time poverty, a sort of exhaustion, and the sense that capital as a kind of agentive force is somehow colonizing even like your innards, and it's there in your hand on your phone, and it's there in your brain when you wake up in the morning. So that sense of kind of an oppressive closeness and the question of time, I think, is there as well. But perhaps we should move to answering some of these questions.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen them trickling in.
Shall we maybe take just that top one there, which is from Tara. I wonder if there are any particularly significant writers working today who you'd point to as being deeply engaged with Marx's work / continuing the legacy of his writing, whatever shape that might take. I'll let you go with that one.
Yeah, we're actually, this is something that is probably to be announced tomorrow, but that's a central concern, I think, for me anyway, in looking at this book and kind of building on it. We're going to have a series of conversations that hosted by Repeater Books with various writers and thinkers who I think are precisely doing that. I guess that Mark does that himself too in the book itself. I think the one that resonates most with me is he makes a very sort of humbling nod to the work of Helen Hester and her concept of domestic realism, and says himself that he thinks domestic realism is a more important concept now than his own capitalist realism. But I think in terms of dealing with Marx's work in itself, I mean, there's a whole network, I think, of people. I think there's obviously a lot of Marx's colleagues. There's Owen Hatherley at Tribune, who released a lovely essay yesterday to commemorate Marx, the 4th year since Marx's death, by Alex Niven. It's a question of where to even start. Almost, I think that it's but a lot of it's happening online, even, or is it even? I guess that's part of the question. That a lot of the network that Mark was involved in, it was so sprawling, and a lot of those people are still active. And I guess that's kind of the joy of Mark's work. I just recommend deep diving and just following his references, because Mark's often referencing his peers and friends. And many of them are thankfully still with us and doing a lot to continue his work. I think Mark, in a way, was often a lot of his own concepts are trying to uplift the thinking of others.
So yeah, I mean that's true. I mean that is something to say. Is like that one of the things I think is a distinctive like Fisher hallmark is, and it's a very kind of bloggy way of writing and thinking, is to go like, this concept has been done over here. Okay, well, here's my riff on it because I've also been reading this or that, and that refines it in this way. Or here's something I hate about this idea, etc., etc. So the way in which I think it's one way that people should be continuing Marx's legacy is trying to undertake that kind of intellectual. That kind of intellectual work. The other thing to say is that there is a whole imprint that is effectively one of Marx's most significant legacies, which was Zero Books, is now Repeater. The entire catalogue there, I think, bears the hallmarks of the kind of things that Marx was interested in. So I mean, look there, I think, and then start writing yourself. I mean, it's just like they contribute. I think it's important. Okay, let's. I failed to click that one. I have answered that one. Let's do this top one here. Did Mark address the intersection of technology and conspiracy that's maybe the most powerful contemporary form of false consciousness raising? Could we call it acid fascism, and how can we apply Marx's thought to combat it? That's a thread that I briefly referenced in the preface to the new
collection. There's two blog posts that Mark wrote, and I think a very productive summer in 2004, where he has this one blog post called Psychedelic Reason, where he introduces his love of Spinoza, and he follows that up with a post called Psychedelic Fascism, which I think is an analysis of Stanley Kubrick and especially A Clockwork Orange, and seeing how I think the final scenes of A Clockwork Orange for him are kind of representative and in a kind of extreme way of what an acid fascism would look like. But beyond that, I'd recommend this. Again, this is the problematic that comes with the giant K-punk tone. There's so much that's still out there that's lesser known and should be better known. There's an essay of Mark's called Touchscreen Capture, where he explores Jody Dean's concept of communicative capitalism, and that in itself is how since the release of the first iPhone, capitalism has tried to monopolize the ways that we communicate with one another, and how that is just inevitably going to generate, if not conspiracy, in the sense that we understand it now in the age of fake news, which I guess Mark never was lucky enough never to fully experience to the extent that we have over the last 4 years. But he was definitely engaged with the impact of technology on how we communicate and share ideas. Both, I mean, he was demonstrating it in a positive manner as far as he could, but also, very aware of how detrimental it could be to, consciousness and consciousness raising.
Yeah, I mean, I would point to there's been some work done both by writers in Australia whose name escapes me momentarily, and Keir Milburn, who's part of the ACFM crew, on kind of the cosmic right, and which is kind of his name for this sort of sort of countercultural kind of conspiracy theory right. I mean, I do think its prominence points to something hugely interesting and hugely, yes, in one sense, hugely dangerous, but dangerous is a kind of cliche thing to say here. Like the way in which these technologies have produced this kind of consciousness, and the question of the sort of sincerity with which people hold it, because so it's the question with the kind of QAnon stuff and the conspiracy theory people in the States. Is the question of how seriously they believe in what they're saying, and whether it's now pretty obvious that at least some of them believe it very seriously. But I think there's an interesting halo of people for whom it is kind of an intentional or chosen belief, for whom they would like this thing to explain the world in this way, and therefore are actively engaging with it and attempting to make it true. I think that's incredibly, incredibly interesting. I'm not necessarily sure it's a practice that could be replicated for other political forms, but I think it tells us something. I'm not quite sure what I think about it beyond that. I think that's what's happening. Whether I think that there is a mode to combat it, like I really do genuinely think that the thing that Mark identifies as consciousness raising here, is essential, and it's essential in the form that he put it. Right, the idea that there are such things as bad perspectives, wrong perspectives. Which I think is important. Let me look through these questions. Will the recordings of the lectures be made available? That's one for you, I think.
They are around online. I guess that the main reason for putting the book together is that they're pretty unlistenable. They weren't made with any professional software. They were just made by a student in Mark's class for note taking. So they are around. You can probably Google search them, but it's easier to read the book, believe me.
Yes.
as having done the task of listening to like all 10 hours, it's a slog. So unfortunately, they won't be released in any official capacity because it's just the quality's not there.
Mm-hmm. I think there's an interesting question here from Jade. Just saying, I understand Fisher's design much as like to recenter class alongside race and gender. While the course contains feminist texts, I have now just lost the question because it's moved. Where are you? There we go. While the course contains feminist text, it doesn't include any works discussing how the experience of race intersects with / informs his ideas about post-capitalist desire in the way that I think he does relate feminism to it. Is there a reason for this? Is this a weakness in some of the work? And an apology that the question wasn't brief, but it's a good question, I think, and a really important one. Do you want to jump in on that?
I guess I can't. It's not something that I feel like I can speak to in a way, because it's definitely a critique that I've heard from Mark before, and I think it's a very valid one. But I can't express to any reason why. I feel like it's not really an excuse, I don't think, and it's not my excuse for Mark, but I get the impression that he was often just anxious to stay in his own lane. I think he was very, the specificity of his own experience was something that he always spoke from. And I don't think that he had any desire to speak for other people. That's not that doesn't explain why that's not in the reader of the course. I think that Mark was certainly engaged with a lot of that work to do with race, and so were many of his colleagues and close friends. But why that's not a part of his own discussions, I don't know. But I think maybe that it's certainly something of an oversight. But it's one that I think it's very able to, we can correct and should correct in going forwards with the task that he kind of lays at our feet in a way. It's maybe slightly a pathetic response to the question, but it is an issue. It's an issue. Yeah.
I mean, I agree. I mean, I think it'd be entirely untrue to say that there was no engagement with it for him personally. I mean, that's obviously not true. It's curious that it's an omission in the text, and if you think about the sort of first waves of the kind of the protests coming out of the United States, which would go on to become everything that they did become, which would be, I think, just around the time, would maybe just a little bit before these lectures being written. It seems to me that there is actually fertile ground here. It seems to me that like lots of the ways that Mark is expressing his vision of like political agency is drawing on some of that stuff, but for whatever reason, like the direct references are suppressed. And as you say, whether that's just an anxiety about kind of propriety simply, I think is an interesting question. I mean, it strikes me that there's a lot that can be drawn. That question about the division between, the desiring or the aesthetic and the political. These are questions which have occupied people in the States in struggle in the 70s. Which is why I think that God, what's his name? It's the book on the 70s that's part of the course. Anyway, it will come to me.
It's left. I know the one you mean. Yeah, but it's vanished.
Which is basically a history which draws a comparison between, which has like intrinsic historical comparisons within it between the 70s and the 30s, and which then speak from, uses the 1970s to speak to today as well. And that's a strong, again, element in that story as well. So I think it's not there. You're right, but it is something that is, that I can see how it can interface with. Let's talk about this question here from Will Cashmore on desire, and he says that it's striking that quite early on, the question of desire is very clearly addressed. There's Marcuse and Lyotard, but the text don't necessarily, the text chosen don't necessarily seem to be one talking about the politics of desire, at least not in its typical French sense. What are we to make of this? Is it a new approach to desire or a move beyond it? So this is, I should say, this is something that struck me while reading, because there's a sort of folk politics of desire. Folk politics, obviously, a term that is of great interest to Mark, not used uncritically, I think, because I think he has the sense, as I have the sense, that it can become a rather glib way of accounting for your own politics by saying, oh, well, X, Y, Z is folk politics. But nonetheless, there is a sort of folk politics of desire which came and which I think still probably predominates, on much of the left, which is about, that, repression is bad. We need to just unleash desire. And then when you unleash desire, that overturns bad things like repression. And then that leads to liberation. Of course, his interest in Marcuse here is to tell you that's exactly not what happens, right? It's exactly not what happens. But it is true that nonetheless that desire is actually not central to what Mark is talking about directly in many of these lectures. And it struck me as curious, and I wonder if part of that is because it's very hard to do directly. You've got to come at it from these kind of angles. I mean, the sense again, I say is that the sense I have in a lot of the work is that there is, or that certainly post 2008, there's the sense of a kind of a political desire which is blocked, right? Which is blocked or repressed or whatever. And that sort of seeks these kind of expressions, extra parliamentary, identitarian, whatever, and that all of them never seem to kind of quite fulfill, or they only take it so far, or that the vehicles. So it seems to me to be a question about recognizing the desire produced by a kind of confrontation with this kind of totality of capital in front of you, and then just looking at the kind of poverty of resources we have to realize it. But I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, my sense of it is perhaps that I think you're right that Mark doesn't come at these things directly, but I almost feel that's for very good reason, because when considering the names that appear most frequently in all of his essays and are never really engaged with I guess directly what I mean is, I guess, an academic sense of referencing and explication, but one of the central names that appears in Mark's work so often is Lacan, and beyond a kind of Žižekian mode of trying to of applying Lacanian thought through popular culture as a way to explicate these very complex ways of because Lacan is a nightmare, but I feel like that's kind of the issue, even the issue that the course unfortunately ends on. I guess the Lacanian idea of desire being that sense that every drive is a death drive. So every drive is to it seeks to abolish itself. But we kind of never do that. We always kind of circle around the issue because we never to abolish desire is then to kind of short circuit the system. I guess we kind of don't know how to do that. And I guess the issue for Mark in a way is that's partly a way of understanding capitalist desire, the things that we want under capitalism, being that we never quite want to fulfill ourselves because that will lead to post-capitalism, and that's kind of the feedback loop of that argument is complex, but it's kind of what Mark addresses when using Lyotard. Lyotard makes the same critique of Marx, saying he never finished Capital because of that kind of, he has this desire to always be able to attack the system. Without the system, he has no project, so he can't finish it. And that's kind of one of the most heretical arguments that Lyotard makes. But I think Mark's kind of taking that very seriously and suggesting how that's an issue for us all politically. And there's even an issue within capitalism that's partly the reason why we have these specters of Marx wandering around, that capitalism, having finally won out in the end of the 1980s, start of the 1990s, has to perpetually produce critiques of itself. Otherwise, it loses all illusion of its own progress. Capitalism has to sustain, even sustain its own enemies. Otherwise, there's no satisfaction in winning a one-horse race, which is ultimately what we're in. So I guess it's I think the question of desire is kind of tangled up with those kinds of paradoxes. And yeah, I feel like it comes back to that question of punk and post-punk. Like, I feel like that's always what Mark's kind of chasing, how to to really firmly deal with that kind of what feels like a very theoretical problematic, but actually has very real a very real impact on how we fundamentally live our lives and think about the future.
So there are a couple of questions I want to take together, which I think actually talk to each other in a way. So one is that Marcuse said to Adorno in '68 that the situation was in fact not a revolutionary, not even a pre-revolutionary one. So what, if anything, did the left come close to at that time? How are we closer now? And then another question is from an anonymous attendee, which is to do with the periodization question within Corbyn. I've just lost the question. There we go. So it's saying, listening to a lecture Mark did in 2016, all this is temporary, the CCI collective. He talks about the prospect of Corbynism being smashed, but he's in an optimistic mode. He says, just because Corbyn couldn't exist without Syriza and its obvious failure, whatever comes after Corbyn wouldn't be able to exist without the Corbyn movement / experiment. What might this mean for thinking of Mark Fisher's work specifically in a post-Corbyn moment? The reason I want to take those two things together is I think they're interesting that I'm always hesitant to take anyone's pronouncement made in a single pronouncement on whether something was or wasn't a revolutionary moment. Marcuse did say that. Marcuse also wasn't, as my reading of Marcuse is that he flip-flops on this question in 1968, as I think anyone around in 1968 would flip-flop on this question, just like just as throughout the Corbyn period I flip-flops on, is this really a sustainable or plausible project? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. That's simply a fact of political consciousness. I think it's important to say that for anyone who is engaged with politics and doesn't experience that kind of doubt about whether the thing that you're doing is will be successful or could work, or then you need to give your head a wobble a bit. Like that kind of doubt is essential to making politics that still has contact with the everyday. But look, I mean, I think the second part of that anonymous question about like what what comes after Corbyn wouldn't have been able to exist without the Corbyn moment. I think that's true, and I think the thing I was saying here about there being this desire for social transformation, which has all these kind of inadequate vehicles, the extra-parliamentary, the parliamentary, the aesthetic, the sort of highly aestheticized politics of kind of that sort of semi-art school world that you see sometimes, the politics of pure negation, the psychologization, identitarianism, and so on, so on, so on. Corbynism was an extremely successful, the most successful we've had yet, form of attempting to synthesize and move these questions into the mainstream. It had its flaws. What we might think about, or thinking of Mark's work after this, is I think the thing to draw, for me, or the thing that's valuable for me, drawing from Mark's work in the aftermath of Corbynism, is this question of kind of collective practice, the consciousness raising practice, I think, is important in the sense that it draws us away from a kind of spectacular engagement with parliamentary politics, right? So that it says, actually, the stuff that you can do is not just limited to, signing on the dotted line, paying your direct debit, every month, then sort of raging on Twitter when things don't go your way. That's very bad for you, in a sense, right? Like there is a better practice out there, which can lead to, hopefully lead to, more productive forms of, I hate the word productivity, but there we go, more productive forms of political engagement. So I think that's important. And the other side of it is to recognize that, that I think, I think Mark's attraction to, thinking about the, historical counterfactuals is a hugely important one, right? To say that there are, the trajectory that history went down is not an inevitable one, and therefore we shouldn't be in love with the kind of sequences of defeat, but figure out, where the synthesis went wrong, and try to remake it again. I'm not interested in self-flagellation and sort of weeping over the ashes of the past. I think this is an incredibly dangerous and self-defeating position. But I'm rambling, so I'll let you.
No, I agree with you entirely. Actually, I think that's a large part of the project for sure. And part of that Mark's own. I think that talking about flip-flopping as an integral part of political consciousness is something that Mark demonstrated profoundly and bravely in being as productive a blogger as he was. And leaving most of it up to stand the test of time. You read that blog chronologically, and you'll find shades of a very as a complex person as we all kind of are, thinking in real time. And I think that's precisely why it's why the more I think about it, the less surprising I sort of find his return to that sort of 60s, 70s moment. Reading his blog, he would astounded a lot of people. That just it seems totally counter what Mark was really committed to. But I think that's partly it. Yeah, it's not to mourn those defeats, but precisely to see what the successes were and salvage them and carry them forwards and carry the commitment forwards, and see that I think that's precisely what I feel like happens so often in terms of the consciousness deflation that comes from just being battered by sort of dominant media platforms. I feel like it's something that's so blatant with Corbyn that I think we've seen in real time how something that seemed so blisteringly popular and unprecedented in a lot of ways has been so viciously attacked on numerous grounds. And you get to the point where what will define Corbyn's legacy going forwards, from the perspective of the present, you could argue anti-Semitism, and it's a real shame. And it's not, and I think that it's partly the tension that comes from that conversation, right? I don't think anyone wants to deny that as a problem, but when we inflate it to being the defining problem of our present moment on the left, when arguments are made about weaponizing anti-Semitism, I think that it's not to use it itself as a blunt instrument, but rather to precisely, to inflate it, to hide things behind, to hide other successes. And it's kind of dealing with that problem that it's not to say we shouldn't deal with the issue, but also, pay attention to what is being buried underneath it. And I guess that's kind of what you can see throughout history. You look at these various successes on the left in whatever different contexts, and you can see how the failures are what is inflated above all else, and no surprise that it then looms large in our own imaginary. But I think it's precisely digging under that and seeing what's salvageable and what resonates still now with our present. But it was a large part of what Mark really wanted to do and emphasize in those last years with acid communism, especially.
Let's just take this one as I think probably sadly be our last question to wrap up very shortly. Just this question: acid communism as a project seems to look fondly on the 60s counterculture as a time/movement of experimentation, maintaining a manifest optimism in the possibilities for social and personal transformation. But many commentators remarked upon the hippies/countercultural emphasis on individualism as presaging neoliberal lifestyle politics, i.e. Steve Jobs. Can we draw more productively on the lessons of the counterculture in forming an acid communist project for today, one not stuck in the individualist cul-de-sacs? I think, I'll hand over to you on this, but the only thing I would say on that is yes, I do think there are so many important things to draw from kind of the history of counterculture on this stuff. The important thing here is not to lose sight of the fact that the individualist response in the late 60s, early 70s was, as much a response to experiences of really suffocating collectivism as well. Really kind of, a collectivism, gone rather astray in some ways. There's there are lots of kind of excellent sort of feminist texts on this stuff, and it's an interesting historical crux of that question of like, one thing we haven't talked about is the emphasis on various parts here of the way in which, say, abolition of the family disappeared as a demand, in the post-counterculture space. That this period of individualism or kicking against these kind of modes of sort of suffocating collectivism, I think it can be easily missed historically, which is not to say that it also didn't float free of its latches and then become the sort of monstrous plate glass, Steve Jobs style silicon horror that we contend with today, but that it has serious political roots as well.
I guess what I'd add to that is, in part, there's I feel like if there's kind of going back to that question of people that are continuing Mark's work, there's the a recent book that Repeater published by Matthew Ingram, who was a close friend of Mark's, and helped set up the Dissensus Forum back in the day. He just recently published a book called Retreats: How the Counterculture Invented Wellness, which is a really it's a huge book, and because it's really done the work on, I think, part of that question, where we can sort of see how the counterculture is in part responsible for the sort of the goops of this world, that kind of the luxury, making luxurious that sort of well, I mean, wellness. I guess we all kind of know about the wellness industry, but beyond that, Ingram's also arguing that there's still lessons to be learned from that, and I guess it's again part of that unfortunate problem that always happens, right? Where we end up inflating the negative aspects of a culture more than at the expense of some things that are still actually can be generative for us in the present. But beyond that, I think the other thing to emphasize is not just the counterculture of the 60s, but Mark was far more engaged with the 70s as a moment. So kind of decentering the counterculture as being that American flower power thing, and actually looking to Italy in the 70s, looking to France after 68 and the questions that were going on there, which I guess is, that's part where Lyotard comes in. And situating a book like Libidinal Economism as part of the 70s counterculture is kind of a strange thing to suggest, but I think that's part of the sort of alternative history that Mark was trying to flesh out a bit, and see how a lot of there are a lot of resonances still, not just in terms of ideals that were had, but actually that I guess it's illuminating the fact that a lot of these attempts to change the world were to in response to problems that we're still dealing with, and that I guess it's to say that those issues have mutated over time, over the last sort of 50, 60 years, and so must our responses to them. But it's not to mean that we have to be ahistorical in how we consider our failure to get a grasp on things. We can continue to develop ourselves in as much the same way, and sort of the stratifying way that capitalism does. We can undermine that for ourselves by salvaging the successes that were buried, I guess. And I think it's Mark realizing that and trying to run with it was it's surprising, and it's tricky to unfold without him to do it for us. But I think that's something that actually does come across in these lectures quite explicitly, and he talks about it a few times. So I think I can only recommend seeing what Mark himself has to say, because he had a lot to say, and it's still resonating now. I think there's a lot to gain from it.
Right. Well, I think that is pretty much our conclusion for this evening. I will say there are questions that we haven't got to. I encourage conversation on Twitter, I guess, is what passes for a public sphere in our miserable and silicon age. But thank you. This has been the questions. Incidentally, were phenomenal. They're so interesting, and I'm really glad that we've managed to provoke them as well. Matt, thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thanks very much. Thanks for you too. It's really nice to just thanks for joining us, both you and everyone that's hidden in the chat. I hope that this has been a fruitful and enjoyable talk. It definitely has been for me. So yeah, thank you.
And I guess thank you to and from Housemans as well, from whom the book is, of course, available, and where I hope to bump into many of you IRL after the pandemic is over. But that's it for this evening. So thank you and good night.